Hello and welcome to another of our new series of Frontline recaps. We'll be looking at major events in the week around Russia and the war in Ukraine and discussing some of the analysis that's come from Times Radio experts. So today we're reviewing 3 videos and some footage from Syria, and we've got a video from Robert Fox where he's talking about assassinations, a video from Mark Kansian who's talking about setting the conditions for ceasefire talks, and George Grills who's talking about Ukraine's ballistic missile capability. And then the footage is Russia in Syria. So starting with the top, Robert Fox. Fascinating discussion as ever. Robert is a seasoned commentator and knows the subject extremely well, and was using the vehicle of the assassination of the Russian General Kirillov with the booby-trapped scooter outside his apartment block that exploded as he was leaving with one of his aides, killing him and his aide, and whether this was part of a wider Ukrainian assassination campaign.
The thing that we have to say before we come to the detail of him is it is now pretty clear that Ukraine has been running an assassination campaign within Russia, because this comes a couple of weeks or 10 days or so after the killing of an important military engineer, Dr. Shitsky, who was developing new generations of cruise missiles for Russia. And there has been a bombing and subversion campaign since the summer of 2022. It's been rather more effective. No, I shouldn't say that. It's been more effective than the very spectacular psychological drone attacks on Moscow. But then, of course, the less advertised drone attacks have been doing an awful lot of damage in depth to Russian forces, to logistic bases and build-ups, so much so that they have slowed significantly, as we speak, the counterattack on Ukrainian forces in the Kursk pocket, which is not the kind of Christmas greeting that Mr. Putin wants.
Indeed, and we should say the SBU, the Ukrainian Security Service, has told Reuters that its agents have carried out the assassination. How will Vladimir Putin be reacting? Because this is very close to home to him, both in terms of how close Kirillov was to him, but also this assassination was carried out pretty close to the Kremlin.
Within 4 miles of the Kremlin, in a suburb in Moscow, I think southeast Moscow. And as I was alluding, he was remarkably unprotected. The bomb, about 300 grams of highly sophisticated explosive, was attached to the seat, the saddle of a motor scooter at the entrance to the apartment block in which he lived. He was passing by with his assistant, and it made a very big hole. But how relatively unprotected he was. And this is relevant to Putin himself, who is absolutely paranoid about personal security. And he will be going privately absolutely mad about this. He will come up with, I think, within hours, as we are recording, of a blood-curdling threat that he will consider this, that, and the other, bringing the earth down. And, of course, he will cheapening the currency yet again. He will mention nuclear, tactical nuclear, without a shadow of doubt. But that will throw the spotlight back on Kirillov. What was he really up to? And I think that this is where the Ukrainians have made a very powerful information war point, propaganda, in saying the Russians are playing dirty with the risks of a really dirty outcome of attacking or causing an ecological disaster from one of the main nuclear power generation plants within Ukraine, particularly the Zaporizhia plant, which is one of the biggest complexes in the world, if not the biggest. But there are 3, 4, or 5 other ones as well, and the Ukrainians are well aware of it. It's very interesting how the campaign is emerging, because Russia is still going for crude tactics. That is their advantage in weight and in number, in munitions and manpower in particular. I think we're beginning to see the Ukrainians fighting quite I was about to say quite successfully, but more successfully than the commentariat would have, the general commentary in the media of the West, particularly the English language press from America and UK, but particularly America and in Germany, of course, because they've been trying to hint, in Germany for obvious reasons. I don't want to add an extra ingredient, extra current to the current bun, as it were, but it is spectacular in that appeasement of Russia seems to be very much on the cards in the now launched election campaign for February in Germany. What I think is clever is that just listening across the airwaves, and particularly in social media, how well prepared the Ukrainians are for this, that they knew all this was coming, and they're maneuvering. I think they're maneuvering as they always have done. They're quite in a clannish, even gangster culture. They're not telling an awful lot to an awful lot of their allies. They're not showing their hand because they know jolly well that would go out and get into the hands of the Russians anyway. I think as we speak, and we must come back to Kirillov, of course, Russia is in a very bad place. It's not defeated, but it is in a very bad place when you consider this propaganda blow, that in fact the big counteroffensive, despite the massive numbers, is not going as well as it should have done, and Syria.
Well, some really interesting points there, and we'll come back to a lot of them in due course. Just on Kirillov, to kind of round this off, interesting that you say, Robert, that you think this is part of a wider campaign of assassinations. What do you think the scope of that is? And, the paranoia that Vladimir Putin will be feeling about his own security, do you really think that within Ukraine that they would even be countenancing potential attempts on Vladimir Putin's life, or would they see that as a step too far? What is your reading on that?
I think it's a step too far, James, because it's unrealistic. It would not be worth the effort. It would lead to dreadful consequences I think that if there was a main attempt, rather like the attempted assassination of Hitler in, the July plot in 1944, that there would be an awful lot of innocence damaged on the way. And I think that Zelensky, but particularly Budanov and the others who are very, very well aware of the great marsh of public opinion and global opinion, which is still broadly in the developed world, not the same in the South, but broadly sympathetic. They won't want to alienate that. And golly, just the investment by Putin in manpower and money in his own protection. No, they're going to try and unbalance him. And I think they're doing quite a good job. And that's where we have to read it back. I was just trying to recall, you may remember that Putin's great propagandist was Alexander Dugin, and they tried to kill him in August 2022, within 6 months of the war beginning, and they got the wrong target. They got his car and they killed his daughter, Daria. But that was the sign. That was the first indication that there really was a sophisticated assassination campaign, and it's gone on. And I said the last one before Kirillov was the killing of Mikhail Shatsky, who was shot in woods. So their intelligence, one must say, that the subversion squads of the security service, and it's not mainstream military of Kiev, their intelligence is really pretty good.
I think there's an attempt from an assassination campaign on both sides. We saw last year General Budanov, the head of Ukrainian GUR, the military intelligence, his wife being poisoned at an event. We've seen the Ukrainians assassinate a Russian sea captain who was responsible for a number of the cruise missile launches from the Black Sea, and that happened in Crimea. We've seen the Ukrainians assassinate and a number of assassination attacks against individuals who are supporting the rebel governments and rebel forces in the occupied regions. This is the first time that we've had an assassination inside Moscow of such a senior general. And under international law, he's directly implicated in the war. General Kirillov, in charge of the nuclear, biological, and chemical forces, will have overseen the Russian use of irritant agents, so CS and CN gas, being dropped from drones onto Ukrainian defensive positions. Now, you'd think it's an irritant, it's not a chemical weapon, but it is a chemical weapon, and it is banned to be used in that sort of way under international legislation. And therefore, that has caused a number of casualties on the Ukrainian side, and has given the Russians an unfair advantage in the way they've been attacking into these positions. But also, General Kirillov has been the purveyor of a lot of disinformation regarding potential biolabs and US and European and NATO involvement in supplying of biological capabilities or chemical capabilities, and he's behind a lot of the nuclear rhetoric that we're hearing out of Putin. So this has sent, I think, a very clear message to all of the Russian generals in Moscow that they're not safe in their own homes and they're not safe going to work. The psychological impact will be much more than the military impact of what's going on. But of course, the psychology of war is as critical as to the outcome of any conflict as the physical actions and physical deaths and injuries that occur. So that psychological impact is huge. Moving on to Mark Kansian's video, and I urge you to watch that. And that's looking at the US, Russia, European positioning for ceasefire talks, and this is in anticipation of Donald Trump's inauguration on the 20th of January, and the statement that Donald Trump has said that he's going to finish this conflict within 24 hours.
Ukraine is clearly very nervous. Part of it is that the counteroffensive of last year failed. They haven't come up with a really good additional alternative approach. The incursion into Kursk was relatively successful, but that is not a complete path to victory. And then they're looking ahead, potentially a war that's going to go on even longer, and they're going to have a new government in Washington, and that is a huge uncertainty. Many Republicans, President-elect Trump, particularly his vice president, have been very skeptical about aid to Ukraine. And, it's not impossible that they will cut that off or reduce it in some way. The other thing is, Trump has said he's going to solve this problem in 24 hours. Well, of course, he's not going to solve it in 24 hours, but he's made so many such commitments that it's almost certain that he will launch a peace effort of some sort. And that could end up with a in-place ceasefire, which would be a partial Putin victory. Putin wants to take over the whole country, of course, but he would be allowed to hang on to the territory that he has seized. The Ukrainians would see that as a partial loss. So there's good reason for Ukraine to be nervous.
As you say, the new administration coming in the US is keen to see some sort of peace deal come in Ukraine. But do you think either side here in Moscow or Kyiv is actually keen in a position where they want a peace deal?
Up until now, a peace deal has not been possible because there was just no overlap between the positions of the two combatants. Ukraine wanted all of its territory back, plus reparations, plus war tribunals. And Russia wanted the whole country and certainly was not willing to give anything up. Trump has said that he would pressure both sides, that he would threaten Ukraine with withdrawal of support. He would threaten Russia with an increase in support. Whether that works is hard to say. I think we will see a person-to-person effort here. Trump likes to meet with foreign leaders to make the deal. I think you will see him meeting with Zelensky and Putin, and we'll see whether that leads to something.
And seemingly in anticipation of some sort of talks going on, Russia has really been increasing the amount of manpower and materiel it's pushing into Ukraine. Its losses are at an all-time high in terms of people, in terms of casualties. this is presumably so that Putin can push Russia into a better negotiating position, perhaps. But if he doesn't get the negotiations as early as he'd like, where does that leave Russia's invasion if they've taken such severe losses to get to that better position?
There's no question that Russia has taken tremendous losses, twice those of what Ukraine has taken. But they seem able to sustain those losses. They scramble to recruit manpower. They're providing all kinds of incentives to get people into the ranks. They're trying to avoid a second mobilization, that is, by involuntarily pulling people back into the service. But on the whole, I think Putin believes he can sustain this war, that he can provide enough personnel, he can keep the attacks going, and that eventually Ukraine will crack. Either that it will ask for peace, or perhaps even its armed forces will collapse, and the Russians will be able to make major advances, as they did in the early days of the war.
And today, NATO's Mark Rutte and the UK's Foreign Secretary David Lammy are meeting with Zelensky. How important is it that this meeting is happening, ahead of the Trump presidency, along with a lot of movement in Europe?
I think this is part of Zelensky's effort from the very beginning of the war to maintain his foreign support. He's met repeatedly with heads of government in order to get that personal relationship. He's spoken to many parliaments, he's spoken to the EU, and I think this is a continuation of that effort. Now, it comes at a time when the future of U.S. aid is uncertain, so it takes on maybe some additional significance, but this is part of Zelensky's strategy from the very beginning.
We're already seeing different leaders positioning themselves. It's interesting that President Zelensky, Ukrainian president, has a few weeks ago come up with his plan for the end of the conflict. And then as part of that plan for the end of the conflict, he's said that he's willing to cede certain territory for a period of time, link that to NATO membership, and then getting that territory back from a diplomatic perspective and linking that to ceasefire. Only in the last day or so has he said that he doesn't have the military capability to take the territory back. But then that's not a recognition, I think, that the war is not going to end from what's happening from a tactical perspective. It's what's going to happen from an operational level in the military campaign. And this is where the Ukrainians retain the initiative, i.e. the assassination of Kirillov, the attacks on oil refineries, on military manufacturing sites, on logistic bases, rail networks, airfields and the like, and the long-range drone attacks that the Ukrainians are having, and ties in with missile attacks, whether those are Western-supplied missiles or Ukrainian developed missiles, more of which in a moment. From a Russian perspective, Vladimir Putin, he has indicated that he wants the Donbass, not just the areas that he has physically taken and is physically controlling. And that's why he's pushing his military very hard at huge cost from a personnel and an equipment perspective. He's trying to take as much as is possible, so that if there is almost a forced line that he has to stop on, then he's got as much territory as possible. His negotiating stance is likely to be, I've got this, I want the rest. He's unlikely to want to give up anything, and that will give both sides, Ukrainian and the Russians, diametrically opposed positions when it comes to Trump wanting each side to give some form of concessions. The EU is interesting in this. From a collective perspective, the EU is showing its support for Ukraine and continuing to do that. I think it's got its eyes on the rebuilding of Ukraine and the contracts that are coming in the future there, rather than necessarily military support. That's coming from a national perspective, whether that national support is coming out of NATO, which most EU members are members of NATO, or whether it's coming out of bilateral agreements. Again, we're seeing different stances that are going on, and those stances are going to be influenced throughout certainly the early part of 2025 by the political hiatus that there is, in particular in France, because we've seen the collapse of the French government, and the fact that there can't be elections in France for at least another 7 or 8 months, and whether the new Prime Minister that Francois Macron, the French president, has appointed, whether he can pull a government together, and whether that government can actually make any decisions with regard to support to Ukraine. And of course we've got Germany, and the government in Germany has collapsed. And what comes in from that with the elections, Chancellor Scholz has had a vote of no confidence. That's what's collapsed the government. And there's a better than average chance, if Germany goes the way a number of other Europeans are going, that we're going to see a greatly increased right-wing presence, and people will be watching the results of the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland party, and the impact that they will have, because any new German government is going to be a coalition government, almost certainly, because that's the way their political structures are based. And the influence that the AfD will have, and therefore how that'll influence support that Germany gives to Ukraine, will be fascinating. So we've got too many moving parts coming together at the moment. Both Putin and Zelensky are starting to move their chess pieces. I think Zelensky's got his chess pieces when it comes to Trump and it comes to everything else in a much stronger position than Putin has. But we will see after January the 20th. Our third video is with our own George Grills, and he's talking about Ukrainian domestic production of ballistic missile capability. And if you don't know about Russian ballistic missile production and Ukrainian ballistic missile production, you need to watch this video. Absolutely fantastic. I learned a lot from it.
Visited recently Dnipro, which of course was the scene of that Oreshnik missile attack by the Russians a few weeks back. But you were also there to look at the prospective Ukrainian ballistic missile program. So tell us a bit about what you learned.
Well, I think the kind of common consensus after that strike was this was a message to the West. This was Russia trying to reassert its kind of its deterrence by saying, look at all these medium-range ballistic missiles we have in our arsenal. We could very well hit European capitals as well, not least American cities with intercontinental ballistic missiles. That was the common consensus. This was a message for the West, particularly in response to those Storm Shadow and ATACMS strikes into Russia. But I think we were underplaying what they targeted and why they targeted, and that this was simultaneously a message to the Ukrainians. So the Russians decided to hit Pivdenmash, which was known as Yuzhmash in the Soviet Union, and it was basically the center of missile building in the Soviet Union. So when you think of the, for example, the Satan intercontinental ballistic missile that the Soviet Union could kind of wipe out New York or Los Angeles with, and they developed this technology in the 1960s. This was all built by Ukrainian engineers. This was built in Ukraine, and so they have a long legacy of building very powerful ballistic missiles. Obviously, that fell into disrepair at the end of the Soviet Union. The missile orders dried up, though the factory remained and there was still the expertise. They weren't building these missiles. Now, Zelensky has, as well as kind of building up a long-range drone program, so they want to build 30,000 long-range drones next year that would be able to hit Moscow. They want to supplement that with building a domestic ballistic missile, one that would not require Western permissions. It would allow Ukraine to hit Moscow, given the kind of reputed range of what this missile would be. And that would, if you think about in the context of a possible peace deal, if Ukraine is not going to get to NATO, what sort of deterrence can it build up? And having, a combination of kamikaze drones and a few ballistic missiles that could hit Moscow, that's another way of making Putin think twice. So what I was doing in Dnipro was trying to kind of look into how feasible is it that Ukraine can build at least a few ballistic missiles, or enough to deter a third Russian invasion if there is a peace or some sort of temporary ceasefire coming next year.
And with Pivdenmash, I think I'm right in saying the Russians claim they had essentially destroyed it. Is that true?
No, it's rubbish, as most things spouted by the Kremlin are. I mean, it's a huge site, firstly, and the Russians have tried to hit it many times before. And so if you drive around it, you can see the scarring on the buildings. You can see windows blown out on several of them, but it's massive. And if you speak to the residents of Dnipro, I mean, at one stage, the factory alone employed 1 in 3 families in the city. So it just almost anyone you speak to on the street will have some sort of family connection, if not friends who work there, and they'll tell you, that it was designed during the Cold War to. As one of the Soviet Union's most strategic sites to survive potentially American nuclear weapons and the rest of it. It is not built to be, wiped out by a singular ballistic missile. It seems most probably that there is some sort of subterranean workshops there that they're pretty confident it's not going to get hit, and can survive strikes such as the Oreshnik one. So no, I mean, judging by the fact that there were cars pulling in and out, even though you could see that the windows were blown out for all these different missile strikes, I think it's very much operational.
So as far as we're aware, the Ukrainian ballistic missile program is continuing pretty much unaffected.
We haven't had an update since the Oreshnik strike, but given that the damage that seems to have been done by it was fairly minimal, and just before the strike, Zelensky had confirmed there had been a successful test of this ballistic missile, which is called Kremlin, which means Thunder 2. It seems pretty unlikely.
Do we know how many ballistic missiles Ukraine wants to be able to produce? I mean, you can see the incentive, as you say, if they don't have to have permission from the US or the UK in order to fire them in the way they do for the ATACMS or the Storm Shadows. You can absolutely see the incentive. But do we know how many they want to build?
They haven't said that yet, but I would say the mass comes more from the drone program. If you look at the kind of same as what Russia is doing to Ukraine nightly across the country, which is you send, well, in Russia's case, usually over 100 drones, attacking from various different angles to try and kind of overwhelm the air defenses, confuse them, and then you send a smaller number of ballistic missiles, which are the ones that are really going to do the damage. So I guess what Ukraine is trying to do is build up an arsenal that mirrors Russia's own, and means that Moscow is not immune from this war.
And how worried do you think Vladimir Putin will be about the Ukrainian ballistic missile program, especially when you consider that it was a Neptune anti-ship missile that sunk the Moskva, the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet? So Ukraine does have some form here.
Yeah, you can't afford to underestimate Ukrainian production, and that's why they targeted Pivdenmash. I think there was a logic to sending a message there, which is basically, if you may be building a missile, but look how many we've got, and look at the newest one that we've just made. So definitely he'll be concerned. I mean, bear in mind the utterly farcical premise for beginning, or one of the premises for building the wall was, for beginning the war was that Ukraine was going to host nuclear weapons and Western ballistic missiles and all this rubbish. Well, it's kind of backfired if he ends up with Ukraine building its own.
The majority of Russian ballistic missiles, strategic ballistic missiles, they're big ones, intercontinental ballistic missiles, ranges in excess of 5,500 kilometers, or intermediate range ballistic missiles, 3,000 to 5,500 kilometers. The technology behind those, the development of those, they were all produced in Ukraine. And therefore Russia has relied on Ukrainian engineers and Ukrainian manufacturing capability to manufacture the capability that they've got. That's part of the reason why I think we saw the Russians use a new intermediate range ballistic missile in recent weeks, because they're trying to suggest that they've replicated that manufacturing capability and that technology inside Russia. But Ukraine is also developing its own ballistic missile capability, and President Zelensky said that earlier this year they've successfully tested their first ballistic missile, and they're on their path to produce hundreds through 2025, if not more. If there's any ceasefire that comes in next year, and Ukraine's got a ballistic missile production capability back up again and is starting to produce more and more, that's something that will really concern Vladimir Putin and something that he won't want. This is another factor that'll come into any peace negotiations if the peace negotiations actually get started. I think Donald Trump's ambition to start them within 24 hours or to have the peace agreement signed within 24 hours is exceptionally ambitious and unlikely to happen. I suspect by the end of next year there'll still be fighting going on. And then finally, as we look at what's happening inside Syria, and we can't take what's going on inside Syria away from what's happening inside Ukraine and how that's impacting Russia, because as I said earlier, the conflict is going to be won or lost not on how the tactical front line in the east of Ukraine changes, but on what happens from an operational perspective, the coordination of all activities across Russia, Ukraine and elsewhere, but more importantly a strategic perspective and how that sets the conditions from a wider global perspective in what's going on. And therefore from a global geopolitical perspective, Syria is embarrassing for Vladimir Putin. Now Putin has said in the last day or so that he does not see the fall of Bashar al-Assad and Syria as a loss, but he would see it as a loss if he loses the sea base at Tartus and he loses his air base at Leterkia. Now those are critical for Putin. The Tartus sea base is the headquarters for his Mediterranean fleet. That gives him his only naval presence in the Mediterranean. He can't influence that from his Black Sea fleet because it can't come out through the Bosporus Strait because Turkey's controlling that and doesn't allow warships to transit through it anymore. So that would be a significant strategic blow for Putin. And his airbase at Latakia is used as a staging post for Russian operations into Africa. And Russia is increasing its influence into Africa, recruiting Africans into the military to fight inside Ukraine. But also with the rump of the Wagner group throughout Africa, it's his money pot. It's where he's exploiting access to hardwoods, to precious metals, to gems, diamonds, gold, and other sources of resources that are not party to international sanctions. It's easy for Putin and his oligarchs to move precious goods around the world instead of money because none of the international banks will touch the money from these sanctioned individuals. So that's critical to Putin and Putin's survival and critical to the strategic positioning that Putin's got and his influence that he'll have when it comes to his negotiating position for anything in Ukraine. We can see the Russian troops withdrawing from the bases or preparing their kit to withdraw from their bases. The Mediterranean fleet has taken to sea. How much is actually left in port is very little indeed. And we can see Antonov and the Antonov transport aircraft are manufactured in Ukraine. Antonov aircraft coming in, the heavy lift aircraft coming in and taking a lot of the Russian equipment out. The Russians are saying in their commentary that they're staying, but whether they are actually staying or not is a different matter. And it's going to be very difficult considering that the Russians were bombing the HTS rebels only a couple of weeks ago and they now are trying to negotiate retaining their bases. They were supporting Bashar al-Assad. HTS were fighting against Assad. And Assad's troops were dropping chemical weapons on areas that HTS were controlling only a few years ago. So the Russian position, I think, is very weak indeed. They will be offering HTS a lot when it comes to money and other support to try and retain access to these bases and retain these bases. Whether they have any military presence or capability at them or not is a different matter. Too early to tell what's going to happen. This is something that we'll see unfold in the coming weeks. So that's a recap of the events of the week. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to put comments down below and we can answer that in our weekly Q&A. And sign up for Times Radio membership to get more exclusive content. Thank you.